Hello everyone and welcome into yet another edition here of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for joining me on this wonderful Wednesday afternoon for another great show. As always, for today's show, we start off talking some Thursday Night Football. Very big NFC East matchup tomorrow night between the Commanders and Eagles, so I got you covered in all things betting, from over-unders, money line spreads to some player props for you. And then I'm going to conclude my positional rankings for Week 11 of the NFL season with my tight ends and my defenses. And then, last but not least, as always, I present to you my weekly shadow report, the key wide receiver cornerback matchups I believe will define the week in fantasy football. But before we get into any of that good stuff, I do want to remind you that if one of you content this or just follow the shows and networks on the podcast and sports networks here at GSMC, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the shows and networks as well to keep more up to date. But if you want to contribute to our shows more directly while we are live streaming, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact. You can do one of two things, actually one of three things. Go to our website to leave a tip or donation at gsmcpodcast.net, or leave it just here on YouTube by clicking the $ in the chat box by the comments section, or you can just leave any comments, questions, or concerns you may have throughout the show in my comment section. They will show up on my screen, and I will read them on air. Great way to get your opinions out there. We love hearing them. They just make this show that much better. But without further ado, let us jump into tomorrow night's big game between the Commanders and Eagles. Huge NFC East showdown that could determine who is basically the number 2 seed in the NFC this season, because no one's catching the Lions. But this game is very important in terms of the outcome of the NFC East. And that team who wins tomorrow night is most likely to be the favorite for the number 2 seed. Despite, all the rumblings about how San Fran might get back into the picture. The NFC North is just so crowded and things of that nature. This is firmly for the NFC East title race advantage, and also that number 2 seed and home field advantage, most importantly. So, tomorrow night's game has perhaps the hugest stakes of any Thursday night football game, potentially in history. Usually we get a lot of duds on Thursday night football, but this is actually the biggest game I think I can remember in recent memory that takes place on a Thursday night. And so looking at it from this perspective, it really is one of those games where you have to tread lightly, but also might want to throw your hat in the ring in terms of a betting perspective, because it is one of those games you can get caught up in the excitement, the hype surrounding it, and you definitely want to be wary of the betting market for a game like this. So, in terms of a general betting perspective, here's how it looks. Philly is a 3.5 point favorite at home. The over-under is 49.5. Not necessarily the highest over-under for a game of this magnitude, but certainly kind of in that range that you should be able to like if you are a frequent bettor. In terms of money lines, Philly minus 170 to win, Washington plus 145. So as you can see, Philly, slight advantage here. They are the home team in this one, but the stakes are high, and so that could even things out. We saw last week when the Commanders had their first real test in facing the Pittsburgh Steelers. I believe that game was on the road, but don't quote me on that. We saw that they are so competitive even in that loss. So we know the Commanders won't be overawed at the occasion of this game. And we know that Jaden Daniels won't be overawed either. This kid has played efficient football, even played through a rib injury in that exciting, heart-rending game against Chicago a couple weeks ago. So we know what he's made of. So he's not going to go into Philly and be unafraid, even though yesterday I did suggest that he may not live up to quote-unquote loftier standards, so to speak. In terms of What I think Jaden Daniels is good at doing. He's good at being efficient, and that doesn't necessarily mean being flashy. This is not an indictment of who he is as a player. It's who he is in this Washington Commanders system that I think is the reason why people might sometimes be frustrated by his lack of gaudy numbers and quote-unquote stat padding, so to speak. So do not necessarily look for Jaden Daniels to be a world beater in terms of passing yards. We'll talk about this in our prop bet segment coming up next a little bit more. But what he's going to do is going to retain the football, move the chains, and do it in a way that can keep his team in the game. Because I think the game is definitely going to be won and lost when Philly's offense takes the field against that Washington defense. Because that's the most uneven, in my opinion, matchup out of all the units on the field. The Philly offense certainly has an advantage in terms of talent, but they don't have the advantage in terms of play calling. All the production that we're seeing from the Philly offense kind of stems from their improvisational abilities. I feel like Nick Sirianni in some ways is holding them back in terms of, sometimes letting Saquon run too much or not necessarily taking as many deep shots as fans might want with that vertical talent you have with both A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. But one thing that's lacking is definitely the usage of Dallas Goedert is kind of a shocking storyline here for me, because I really think Dallas Goedert is the X factor into how seriously I will be taking Philly as a Super Bowl contender come playoff time, because we know what their weapons are capable of. A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, we know. But we don't necessarily know if Dallas Goedert can be the kind of skeleton key to unlock everything when they're in a pressure cooker situation come playoff time. And this could be a perfect litmus test for that. This is a pressurized game. Yes, they're at home, but they need to show me something more than individuality here. There needs to be a cohesive plan, because as much as Nick Sirianni is getting away with it by having the Eagles be such a solid team through these individualistic players, I still think come playoff time, they're going to need to start planning to see certain things, because everything changes in the playoffs. And so this game will test that. But then we look at the Commanders' defense, and then we say, okay, perhaps this isn't necessarily the best caliber of defense on a playoff team or presumptive playoff team in the NFL right now, because it's certainly been showing signs of improvement. They acquired Marshawn Lattimore before the trade deadline, and it's a nice pickup. Bobby Wagner's throwing it back to 2013 when he was in Seattle, and they have a lot of nice talent. But this is still a defense I can't wholly trust in games of this magnitude. They have some mental lapses, some miscues where you can take advantage of them, and we saw it against Pittsburgh, Russell on that play to win the game, to that deep fade to Michael Williams. I feel like that's one of those situations where the Eagles are looking at it and can say, okay, maybe the vertical passing game can work a little bit better against this defense than others. And so that's what they're wanting to exploit. But I don't necessarily think if the Eagles do put up a lot of points, it will indicate future success come playoff time, because you're going to be facing a lot of tough defenses. The Vikings most likely will be there. The Lions too. The 49ers, they'll be very tough come playoff time should they get in. The Cardinals and Rams, sneaky teams in the NFC West that if they sneak into the playoffs can really hurt you on the defensive side of the football. And maybe, if Seattle, this is wishful thinking, But the point being, there are a lot of tough defenses in the NFC. And so the Philadelphia Eagles have to take care of business against the defenses that are going to be in the playoff picture, instead of, dominating these inferior teams who can't keep up with their offense. Because chances are, if Philly goes into the playoffs and they're relying on individuality for Saquon Barkley to get X amount of touches, for A.J. Brown to get X amount of receptions, for Devontae Smith to contribute X amount of times, for Jalen Hurts to improvise X amount of times. It's not going to go according to plan because they have no plan. And so I need to see Nick Sirianni step up in terms of taking accountability for this offense whenever things go awry. But then on the Commanders side of things, this game is more about seeing where you're at, because I still don't necessarily view them as a true contender. I view them as a very solid playoff caliber team. But this game, and I feel more so than the Pittsburgh game, because it certainly felt like that Pittsburgh game was a little bit iffy in certain moments for them. And that loss, because of that one big play from Russ, was indicative of that kind of miscue nature to their play in some moments. And this game, I feel like, is a better test because Philly isn't necessarily as well-rounded right now than Pittsburgh, if we're looking at it this way, and they're certainly less well-coached than Pittsburgh. So, for the Commanders, take advantage of moments where Philly might let down their guard, especially on the defensive side of the football. Because if you can create and generate takeaways against this Philly offense, you're as good as gold. Because I don't necessarily trust that Philly defense that much, and you gotta trust that Jaden Daniels is unflappable at this point. Even in games where he loses, he still looks efficient, and he can still operate this offense at a high level, and until he proves otherwise, then the Commanders will be in this game. But that being said, just because of that home field advantage, and just because I feel, Jalen Hurts and Saquon Barkley have been doing this all season, I still have to take the Eagles. It's no slight to the Commanders. It should be a fascinating game to watch, but I still have to take the Philadelphia Eagles in this one to not necessarily take command of the NFC East just yet, but to stick their head above Washington at this point in the season. Let me know what you think about this game in the comments below. We'll be talking about it a little bit more right after we come back from the break in terms of a prop betting perspective. A lot of interesting players to analyze there. We'll be right back to talk about them after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you yet again about the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features you can use here on YouTube to contribute and interact with the show while we are live streaming. You can do two or even three things if you do not prefer YouTube as your base of support. You can contribute through the GSMCpodcast.net website and leave a tip or donation there. Or you can click that $ in the chat box by the comments section, leave a tip or donation through that way. Or you can make yourself available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features. Leave a comment, question, or concern you have throughout the show in the comments section that I will be able to read out loud. Just makes the show that much better. But without further ado, let's jump into our second segment of the day, sticking in the world of Thursday Night Football, talking about some player props that really intrigue me in this game. And I think this game is very stylistic in terms of how each offense is defined by certain players. We have the Washington Commanders, who rely on Jaden Daniels in the system in his first year to run it efficiently as possible, and most importantly, make him comfortable and make his best traits really pop. On the Eagles side of things, it's kind of a laissez-faire approach where they kind of leave the players be and let them play the way they know how and see what comes of more improvisational skill rather than kind of game script and game flow determining what they do. So it's kind of an easier way to analyze these props from that sense, but it's still a very exciting game in terms of it being an NFC East battle, in terms of what it means for both of these teams. So either way, it's going to be very interesting to see how bettors bet on this game and what I'm about to tell you. Starting off with Jaden Daniels, because he has been someone who it's been pretty easy to analyze from every metric outside of prop betting, just because he's not necessarily meant to be a bettor's favorite quarterback week in, week out. We've seen him, I believe, hit the under on most of his games, and people kind of get mad at that and kind of get skeptical and frustrated of what that means for him as a betting quarterback. But I can see why, he still is attractive to bet on, because he's just so easy to analyze outside of betting and so easily to analyze once he is taken into account inside of the betting perspective. However, I'm going to kind of take a risk here and say he's going to hit the over in terms of passing yards at 224.5 minus 117. It would be kind of easy and the safest bet to take the under here. But I think what we learned from Jaden Daniels is not necessarily to trust metrics, right? It's more so to trust his efficiency and his knowledge of his offense. Because once someone gets into games of this magnitude and they're a rookie quarterback and they've seen how their system works out, they're going to be more confident and thus more ambitious. And we've seen it a little bit with Drake May. We've kind of seen it with Caleb Williams, but he has kind of regressed a little bit. But Jaden Daniels has been the most effective of them all. And so whether or not he hits the over or under, just his knowledge, his maturity in his rookie season separates him from others in terms of riskiness on the betting market. Because while a lot of bettors probably have played it safe with him all year long, this is the game to get a little bit risky. Because you should know that Jaden Daniels is more likely to hit the under, but you should also take into account where he is this season and where this Washington Commanders team is right now in their situation. So that's why I feel like I can tell you that this can be a very ambitious bet that could hit for you just because of what the Washington Commanders can do and what they've done all year and how they've gotten to this point. On the other side of things, Jalen Hurts is someone who you can bet on in many different manners. You don't necessarily have to look at his passing yards. You don't necessarily have to look at him for his passing touchdowns. You can look at him from a myriad number of ways. And that is why I'm going to say, in terms of rush yards, he's going to hit the over, and he's perhaps more likely to do that than Jaden Daniels. Because while Jaden Daniels kind of runs are more designed, scripted, and come with the flow of the game, Jalen Hurts is definitely more on the improvisational, out of structure side. Because of that, I feel like Jalen Hurts will have more opportunities to run with the football, create plays with his legs, both in the passing game and in the running game. just because of that carefree ability. I don't necessarily think Jaden Daniels is at that level yet. He might get to that level in the future if they start trusting him a little bit more in terms of decision making outside of structure. But Jalen Hurts is someone who, at this point, we know what his propensities are in terms of the running game. And minus 117, that's a pretty safe bet out of both of these quarterbacks because we know the stylistic differences we're going to see between these two quarterbacks. How one performs within the structure of an offense and how one performs without any structure at all. And so Jalen Hurts is going to, in my humble opinion, be very attractive on the betting market from a rushing perspective. Now let's get into some more skill position players here. Starting off with one who I feel like will make his voice heard in this game, but not necessarily in the biggest of ways. He's not going to have a 8 to 10 catch game for 200 or so yards. He's going to have moments where he shines, and that's what I feel he is. He is a very solid wide receiver 1 for Philly, but he's not necessarily someone who relies on racking up yardage in the games of this magnitude. And that's why I think A.J. Brown, in terms of target share and things of that nature, isn't necessarily appealing, so he's going to hit the under for me tomorrow night at 5.5 receptions and minus 146. And it's not an indictment of his skill, his ability as a receiver. It's just kind of a microcosm of what he brings to the table for Philly because he's more of a vertical threat than most wide receiver ones. And from that perspective, I feel like Jalen Hurts is going to want to use him if he can see different flaws in the Commanders' secondary. And there definitely are going to be those moments because, like I said, I think the Commanders' secondary is one that is improving, but it's not quite there yet. So look for Jalen Hurts to want to exploit that, but not often because there are still going to be some things off the cuff with this Philly offense. A lot of things to do with Saquon. A lot of things potentially to get Dallas Goedert more involved. A lot of things to do with Devontae Smith as well, because I think he's the better pure route runner of the two. So I don't necessarily think A.J. Brown will affect this game all the time, but it'll affect this game when it matters in the moments where the Commanders least expect it. So that's why I feel like hitting the under in terms of receptions is a safe bet for A.J. Brown in this game. Then the last two, Dallas Goedert. This one's a little bit of an interesting one. Scoring a touchdown at any time in the game at plus 300. I feel like Dallas Goedert is getting to that level where this Philly offense kind of needs him, and he's going to step up in a big way in red zone efficiency, in terms of exploiting zone coverage, and he's just a physical tight end who's been an unsung hero at the tight end position for Philly all year long. And I feel like, Philly are going to have their opportunities. But I think where they'll kind of suffer a little bit is in the red zone, just because Jalen Hurts gets a little bit more indecisive when he doesn't have as much open field to work with, right? We know that when they get down to a certain yard line, the tush push is always in play. But when it's kind of like 20 to 25 yards out, then it's kind of, weirdly enough, not necessarily a point of strength for Philly, in my opinion, because Jalen Hurts feels too compacted or congested a little bit in the red zone, and thus his big play abilities might get threatened through there. So look for Dallas Goedert to kind of alleviate that burden on Jalen Hurts because of his abilities to exploit soft coverages and his strength in the red zone. So I think he can score a touchdown in this game, most definitely. And I like the value, even though it's kind of a lofty money line for him there. And last but not least, let's talk about Terry McLaurin. And this is a funny bet here because, like I said, the Eagles' defense is certainly one that Terry McLaurin feels he can do well against. But I'm going to say he hits the under here at 59.5 receiving yards, a minus 114. That's certainly an ambitious long shot bet, considering how solid and stellar Terry McLaurin has been this season. When I think about what the Eagles secondary can do, I feel like through the melding of youth and experience, they developed a way where young guys like Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean can play more freely and can play in a more versatile system, whereas the older guys like Darius Slay, and not necessarily old in terms of age, but old in terms of experience with the Eagles and Reed Blankenship, can get less exposed in certain moments. And so I like what they're doing to A, integrate these young players into their secondary, and B, kind of utilize the older guys as the experienced leaders rather than, have them get exposed in coverage in certain moments. And so Terry McLaurin's going to find this to be a tougher test than he initially thinks, because I've loved how Quinyon Mitchell has developed. I love how physical Cooper DeJean has been for this defense. And most importantly, when you have mentors such as Slay and Blankenship, you're going to steadily mature week in, week out. And in a big game like this, look for them to be primed and ready to go, coming out guns a-blazing in this one, and for Terry McLaurin to potentially be stymied for quite some time in this one. Let me know what you think in the comments below. It's going to be an interesting game, especially how you analyze these teams from a betting perspective. But when we come back after the break, we transition to the conclusion of our positional rankings, starting off with the tight end position. Very interesting position, very volatile position as always, so you don't want to miss it when we come right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of the day, we are transitioning into the last of our positional rankings, starting off with the tight end position before we get into our defenses for our fourth segment of the day. But like I always say, tight ends are the most volatile position, most under-respected in the league, but they're still very important week by week because they are a position where you feel like it's definitely more matchups oriented than others. It's not necessarily like running backs and wide receivers where if you're a star every week. It's more so about, okay, this team plays a certain coverage, their pass defense has been pretty bad, and so these tight ends can expose them. It's not necessarily about a stud anymore. It's more about different tiers and how they interact with each other. So this list of 4 players that I've compiled, each in their own right, represents a different kind of tier of tight end. They can either be excellent one week and terrible the next, or they've kind of been steady presences at the tight end position for years. And so, without further ado, let us talk about the position that is most interesting to rank my tight end. Starting off with a guy who really can be an X factor for the Jaguars for the rest of the season, if they're competitive at all. Evan Engram, going up against perhaps the toughest defense in the NFC against the Lions. And the reason why I feel Evan Engram, no matter who's playing quarterback, can perform against the Lions is just because he is someone who has developed so well as a route runner that you kind of have to account for him as a receiver. And it's difficult to do when he's aligned in the slot, aligned on the edge, on the perimeters, because of his A, physicality, his big frame, and B, his excellence at the catch point. And so, while the Lions are a team that are very physical in the secondary, a lot of improvement to their players week in, week out, Evan Engram is a different animal because he is one of the leaders of this kind of skill position group on the offensive side of the football for Jacksonville. And if the Jacksonville offense wants to have any modicum of success against a defense like the Lions, you need a guy like Evan Engram to step up. And whether it be Trevor Lawrence or Mac Jones, look for them to use him as a security blanket early and often in this game. He had 10 fantasy points against a very similar defense in terms of aggressiveness in Minnesota. So it's not necessarily a bad total for someone who has been kind of forgotten this season from a fantasy perspective. Maybe because of the injury early on in the season and how he recuperated from that. But he still is someone you always have to monitor from a fantasy perspective because of how efficient he can be. Should you know this quarterback play continue and start to get more consistent. So Evan Engram, a little bit of a risky pick, but still one who can really produce for you at a kind of consistent level where he's not necessarily putting up gaudy numbers, but consistent numbers, just right for the tight end position type numbers. So look for him to try and exploit a very physical Lions defense. And then the second guy I want to talk about, kind of always there and thereabouts in lists of these nature, maybe potentially a little bit hindered by his consistent injuries with that leg. Always a concern for this guy, but no matter what, he's always going to be someone who is consistent on a regular basis and might just be perhaps the most consistent tight end from a fantasy perspective in the entire National Football League right now. And he's going up against Evan Engram's Jags, Sam Laporta. And not for nothing, I feel like, this has been a down year for him. Everyone was hyped about him after that rookie season where he was the tight end one, albeit with a very, weak statistical kind of achievement in that regard. But he still is someone who a lot of people in fantasy football circles hold in a high regard as perhaps the kind of leader of a youth movement at the tight end position. He had 15.6 fantasy points against Houston last week, despite, perhaps battling through more injuries. And that's always going to be a concern with him because, much like last year, he had a lot of problems with that leg, especially going into the playoffs. So that's a little bit of a concern to monitor. But when he's on the field, when he's healthy, this Lions offense loves having him. Because, even though they have kind of gone more towards the run this season, Sam Laporta is just someone who can exploit you if you're looking for the run. Like that touchdown against Houston where it looked like a run design and they got him open in the end zone and he scored a touchdown. So he's always someone who the Lions feel they can utilize the best of their abilities. And against the Jags defense that, yes, has been very tough to play against in recent weeks, it's still perhaps the weakest defense in the NFL at this point. And so look for Sam Laporta to take advantage of this matchup and continue to prove why, as a young, exciting tight end, up-and-comer, he is going to be one of the premier tight ends in fantasy. And perhaps kind of one of those guys who can say, hey, maybe we have to respect tight ends a little bit more in fantasy football circles. So look for him to continue his ascension at the position. And then another guy, a little bit on the older side, perhaps the opposite, polar opposite of Sam Laporta in this regard, going up against a team he's all too familiar with, Travis Kelce, going up against the Bills. 20.4 points last week against Denver. Solid performance, continuing to be a valuable asset for this Chiefs offense. Perhaps the leader right now of this offense as they've gone through a couple of struggles over the past couple of weeks. But against the Bills, look for him to stay consistent. The Bills, potentially in this game, are going to play a lot of zone coverage to limit what Patrick Mahomes can do downfield. So look for him to take advantage of the easy receptions and targets that Travis Kelce can give you. And so that's why I feel like this duality between young and old comes into play. Even though Sam Laporta has the easier matchup, I feel like Travis Kelce is the safer bet just because of his experience in games of this magnitude and because he's going to know what the Bills are going to throw at him because of how they game plan for teams like Kansas City. So I feel like, including these two guys is paramount to kind of show the contrast between where we are in viewing young and old tight ends. And Travis Kelce stands the test of time. No matter how long he's going to continue to play, he's always going to be the most reliable target for Patrick Mahomes in that offense. And even, if he does decline, potentially, and his target share goes down a little bit if he continues to play, just know that Patrick Mahomes isn't going to be swayed by that. He's always going to view Travis Kelce as an asset in this system. And against teams that want to knock you down a peg, I feel like you're going to have to play your best games in those situations. And not for nothing, the Bills are undefeated against the Chiefs in the Patrick Mahomes era in the regular season. So if you want a player to step up for you, it's going to have to be a guy like Travis Kelce, who's been on this road before. So I can't doubt him in a game of this magnitude against an opponent he's all too familiar with. And so that's why I feel like, I had to present these two guys in that way. Sam Laporta is a young guy who is a paragon of consistency against these inferior opponents, and Travis Kelce, who we know has been around the block and is up against a much tougher opponent, but kind of knows how to break them down. And so that's why it's so interesting to see both of these guys make my list for Week 11. But the last guy I'm going to talk about, again, is kind of one of those lower tier guys who suddenly has risen on the scene, arrived on the scene fully for the Green Bay Packers. Has been quiet for the past couple of weeks, but might in this game be able to make some noise. And that is Mr. Tucker Kraft here. Had a bye week, and now the Packers go and face the Bears. An interesting divisional matchup. Not necessarily the best divisional matchup, but one that could be exciting nonetheless. Just because I'm looking at these Packers receivers against the Bears secondary. Two of the younger units in the league. Two of the more scrappy, hungry, diverse units in the league. And when I think about how they line up against each other, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the Shadow Report, I feel like there's going to be a lot of opportunities for a guy like Tucker Kraft to exploit that Bills secondary a little bit. He's going to try and sit in the pockets between the linebackers and safeties. He's going to try and, help Jordan Love in the short to intermediate passing game. And he's going to also, most importantly, just try and keep the ball with the Packers for as long as possible because, this Bears offense just fired its offensive coordinator in Shane Waldron, should never have been in the NFL in the first place, and I should know that firsthand as a Seattle fan. And they're going to try and get going yet again, but still, you have to respect that about them, that they feel that they on offense can head in the right direction, get back on track. But I feel like in terms of this game, the Packers want to be as efficient as possible, and not get caught up in what the Bears defense can do to them. Because when the Bears defense generates takeaways, that's how they can win football games. So look for the Packers to not necessarily press the situation and, just try and play turnover-free football. And so Tucker Kraft is going to be a big part of that. And I feel like, the reason why a guy like Tucker Kraft has been so volatile this season and been so under the radar in certain sectors of the fantasy football world is because this Packers offense is so unpredictable. Week in, week out, someone can step up over it, and we wouldn't bat an eye just because we know that any receiver can be the lead receiver for the Packers at any given moment. So that's why I feel like Tucker Kraft has been a little bit of a one player who's fallen to the wayside over the past couple of weeks. But look for him to get back on track against the Bears defense that might get exposed if you know they can't generate turnovers early and often in this one. But let me know what you think in the comments, because the tight end position, as always, is not always going to be about Laporta and Kelsey. They're not always going to be on this list. I want to include more guys like Ingram and Kraft because I know what they're capable of. And so look for me to continue to vary my list, especially when it comes to tight ends. Let me know what you think in the comments about each of these players. They're all in very intriguing matchups that I feel favored their best abilities. But coming up next, we conclude officially my positional rankings for Week 11 with my defense and special teams units to monitor for this week in fantasy. We'll be right back after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of the day here on the show, we are officially concluding our positional rankings for the week with my top 4 defense and special teams units to monitor from a fantasy perspective this week. And all 4 of them have been on this list before, but all 4 of them are very unique in terms of style of play. Some of these defenses, we already know how strong they have been on a consistent basis week in and week out through the season, while others have kind of been pleasant surprises, whether they started their surprising runs at the start of the season or kind of in the middle of the season. I feel like each and every defense, and each and every type of defense for that matter, is represented on this list. And so without further ado, let's conclude our positional rankings for the week, and let's talk about some defenses. Starting off with the defense that we kind of alluded to in our last segment, the other defense in that game, the Packers going up against the Bears. Coming off a bye, should be very fresh. And the reason why I love this Packers defense against the Bears is because the Bears offense can't get out of its own way. Even if they try and reinvigorate it with a new offensive coordinator, I feel like they're going to struggle to really get going against a defense that predicates itself on turnovers. I was kind of wrong about this defense in that it's too reliant on things like takeaways, but against a game, and in a game, in the division, against a rookie quarterback who's kind of been a little bit frustrated this season, has had some positive moments but hasn't been able to string them together, he's going to want to come out a little bit too aggressively, and thus a defense as experienced as the Packers in terms of takeaways could take advantage of that. So while this is kind of a matchups-oriented one, it is a safe bet because I think Caleb Williams is going to look a bit erratic in this one and not necessarily play to a standard now that the Bears offense would want out of him. That's why I have to acknowledge the Packers and what they can do against a very deflated Bears offense right now. And the second unit that I want to talk about has been one who's been a paragon of consistency year in, year out under Mike Tomlin. It's the Steelers defense. And yes, it's a tough game because this Ravens offense is so multifaceted. Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry, rather, are 2 of the best offensive players in the league right now. With the Steelers defense, I don't necessarily see that many flaws in it. You can maybe point to some flaws in the secondary, but that front 7 is perhaps the best in the National Football League, and the secondary can paper over some cracks there. They have a lot of decent talent there as well. And so I feel like if they can get Lamar out of structure, focus on limiting the pass game, and kind of hyper-focus on stopping both him and Derrick Henry, they're as good as gold in this one. Because there's no team that I feel can generate the right amount of pressure against Lamar Jackson to really worry him than Pittsburgh. And they've really had a guy like Lamar Jackson's numbers in recent years. He's really struggled against a defense like the Pittsburgh Steelers. And so I have to acknowledge them. Another semi-matchup oriented one here. But I really do think that in a game where a lot of people might be wondering how the Steelers will look, expect very physical and gritty defensive play out of them and going all out to win this game and take command of the AFC North. And then the third defense, this is where we get into these defenses where we weren't expecting to potentially be talking about them this late in the season, whether, they started surprising us early in the season or kind of halfway through it. And this one is of the halfway through variety. They've had some impressive performances against some really good offenses in the Vikings and Lions, actually the Bills, but not necessarily, enough to merit perhaps you fully starting them week in, week out. But I like them in this matchup against the Jets because the Jets are kind of the Vikings/Bills light on the offensive side of the football in that they have the talent, but they just can't put it together. And so the Colts are going to take advantage of that. Very physical linebacking core. So look for Breece Hall to be very limited in this game. Yes, I have some questions about the Colts secondary. A couple injuries there. A lot of youth as well in the secondary that's not yet fully developed. But I still believe that you can get the job done against a very frustrating and tension-filled Jets offense. They only had 3 fantasy points against Buffalo. Again, one of those offenses where when it gets going, the rails can come off for you really quickly on the defensive side of the football. But that's an aberration, I feel like. They've shown me that they're a physical defense that you can't underrate. I love guys like DeForest Buckner and Grover Stewart up front. E.J. Speed and Zaire Franklin in their linebacking core. One of the more underrated linebacking cores in the league. And so look for them to really frustrate and continue to frustrate this really inept Jets offense. And I wish I weren't indicting the Jets as much in this one, but it's where we are in the season. And it's how bad they've been. That, I can praise the Colts defense of all defenses in the league and kind of indict the Jets as well. But it's where we are because the Colts defense really has stepped it up a lot and elevated their game and proven they have the capabilities to be a top 10 defensive unit in the league like a lot of people expected they would be. Whereas the Jets simply haven't elevated anything. That's all there is to it. And our last defense has been the surprise defense of the whole year thus far. Did kind of get banged up and taken through the ringer against perhaps the best team they faced in Baltimore, but still kept that game against Kansas City close enough to where it came within an agonizingly close blocked field goal, even though it wasn't close at all, and we might have known it was coming. But against the Falcons, I feel like the Broncos defense are the right defense in this matchup. What I mean by the right defense in this matchup is that the Falcons always will struggle against certain defenses, and defenses most especially that can generate pressure. And you may not be able to name any of the Denver Broncos front seven, but it doesn't matter. They're physical, gritty guys that can attack the football, play aggressively, can pressure the quarterback. And while the Colts did actually announce that Anthony Richardson is going to be the starter this week. That actually completely slipped my mind. I was talking about a different team entirely that the Falcons were talking about. The Falcons offense, while it is an offense that can operate at a high level, it's highly dependent on Kirk Cousins' pocket passing. If he's forced in any way out of his pocket passing, then he becomes too one-dimensional for the Falcons to win. And it's clear as day, and it's been that way ever since, he was a Minnesota Viking. And so, if, he can't get going here, chances are the Broncos defense are going to smell blood and get more and more aggressive. We saw it when, for example, the Seahawks played the Falcons, and they were able to get their pass rush going and get to Kirk Cousins. Not for nothing, the line play for the Falcons has been shaky as well. It's not, just Kirk Cousins' limited mobility. It's been the line as well. So look for a Broncos defense that has been slowly surprising people to really step up here. Now, in terms of all four of these defenses, I feel like these aren't necessarily the defenses that define what it means to be a fantasy football defense in this day and age. More modernized version of what we think of fantasy football defense, but they're all in their own right special in what they do, and in terms of fantasy production, you can't necessarily ignore them. Take, for example, the Packers. I feel the Packers are so clear-cut in their identity as a defense that you can't ignore them, whether or not they allow 28 points because they have 4 or 5 turnovers. And then the Steelers, they're just the paragons of consistency. Like I say, it doesn't even matter if they generate turnovers. They're going to limit offenses to very few points. And yes, it's perhaps the toughest matchup out of any one of the week, but they've been here before, they've seen this movie before, and they're one of the best teams in the league at limiting a guy like Lamar Jackson. And then the Colts and Broncos, man. Talk about surprising defenses that have steadily improved and matured throughout the year. The Colts really were a defense that a lot of people thought would be very sneaky good this year. And the start of the year, they didn't necessarily look that way. And the secondary got beat up a little bit, but they've definitely shored things up. And they're going up against a team that's very, very frustrated at this point in the season and might be sleepwalking through this one. And the Broncos, they are in the right place at the right time kind of matchup right now, where they're facing a Falcons defense that really does not handle pressure. The Falcons offense does not handle pressure as well as others around the National Football League. Definitely not like the Baltimore Ravens. So look for the Broncos defense to really go off and prove why they're one of the most surprising units in the National Football League this year. But other than that, let me know what you think in the comments about how you view defense this year and potentially this week as well, because it's getting to the point where, you may have to start streaming defenses if they're not defined, and that's always going to be to your detriment if you don't have a decided defense this late in the season if you're making a fantasy playoff push. But let me know what you think in the comments. But for our last segment of the day here on the show, my weekly shadow report. The key wide receiver cornerback matchups will define the week in fantasy football. You definitely don't want to miss this segment right after we come back from this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back to our final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And as always, we conclude our Wednesday show with my weekly shadow report. The key wide receiver cornerback matchups will define the weekend in fantasy football. And a lot of them are familiar faces going up against each other. Some repeat kind of matchups here that we're going to be seeing a little bit more consistently as divisional rivalries get decided and divisions as a result get decided late in the season as well. So without further ado, let's jump into some very familiar matchups around the National Football League between wide receivers and cornerbacks. starting off with one in the Packers-Bears game of very important note here. Jayden Reed going up against Jalen Johnson. Now, this isn't necessarily going to always be the matchup because Jayden Reed lines up in the slot more often than not, and Kyler Gordon is ultimately the Bears' slot cornerback. But the more important thing to note here about the Bears as a whole defensively is that they allow the second fewest catches, TDs, and fantasy points to any receivers in the National Football League. That's how fascinating this Bears secondary is. They're no slouches. They, especially against potentially wide receiver cores like the Packers, where they want to distribute the wealth, can be especially potent and fearsome. And Jayden Reed has to watch out for that. This isn't necessarily always going to be the matchup, like I said, but no matter where they line him up, Jayden Reed is always going to be facing someone who they feel can isolate him and really press him in certain situations. And so I feel like if you're Jayden Reed owner, this might be a week where you might have to sit him out. Just because, it's a very interesting matchup here. Because I think the Packers are the better team offensively, and they can find ways to chip away at the Bears' defense. But it is kind of risky considering the fact that the Bears secondary has some of the best stats and metrics when it comes to stopping the pass. So this matchup certainly is one where I'm not holding my breath if Jayden Reed underperforms a little bit. So look for this to be a very intriguing one, potentially a defining one from a fantasy perspective, just because of how versatile Jayden Reed is and because of how fearsome this Bears secondary has been all year. Then the second match I want to talk about, a low-key one a little bit, because this receiver isn't necessarily as highly regarded from a fantasy football perspective, in my opinion, but he's a very interesting matchup, and I feel like, what with maturity of this offense and how we've seen it grow, he's going to get a lot of chances in this game against a pass defense that I always say is not stopping anybody. It's going to be Courtland Sutton going up against A.J. Terrell. And on the flip side of what the Bears do defensively and stopping the pass, the Falcons allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. So you can see the flip side of that. So it's going to be a matchup, right, where Courtland Sutton may be not appealing to a lot of fantasy owners. But still, when I look at how this Broncos offense has improved and how Courtland Sutton himself has improved as a receiver to kind of take some pressure off of Bo Nix's improvements, he has been someone who is kind of a perfect receiver to pick apart certain defenses. And so, headed into this matchup, I feel wholly confident that we're finally going to see the best of Courtland Sutton. He may not impact the game wholly. He may not impact the game in a way in which you're persuaded and convinced that he's going to do on a consistent basis here on out to end the season and potentially warrant a look at in future fantasy drafts. But he still is a receiver that I think is really excellent at development and maturity in an offense that hasn't really been this consistent in years. And so I'm looking to just to see this matchup, perhaps not gaudy fantasy production, but improvement in a game where I can say this is Courtland Sutton's defining moment. He's not necessarily the prettiest, sexiest of receivers, but he's someone who can get the job done for you and has been a huge part in how the Broncos have evolved on the offensive side of the football this season. So look for this matchup to be a very interesting one. Then the third matchup I want to talk about could potentially be a bloodbath here. Jamar Chase going up against rookie Cam Hart in that Sunday night match between the Bengals and Chargers. And this is one of those situations where a Chargers defense, again, one of the better defenses in the league, one of the top 3 scoring defenses in the league. In every defensive metric, they have been nothing short of impressive. And that's what to expect out of a Jim Harbaugh-led team on defense. This is their toughest test. And I know it's funny to say when they're in a division with the Chiefs, and I think they have a couple interesting games. I'm going to have to pull up their schedule here. But this is a very prolific offense. Joe Burrow is playing some of the best football of his career right now, and he's doing it by distributing the wealth, but most importantly, keying in on the Chargers. And the Chargers, not for nothing, have not necessarily faced the biggest gauntlet of receivers. They faced some terrible teams like the Saints, the Titans, the Browns, the Panthers early in the season, the Raiders. So they haven't really faced tough offenses. But this is the start here. After the Bengals, right? They're going to face the Ravens, the Falcons, the Chiefs, and the Bucs. A lot of good offenses along the way to end their season. And it's going to tell us a lot about this Chargers team. But if there is any weakness to it, it's that secondary, in my opinion, especially with Cam Hart in its starting role. So look for Jamar Chase to exploit that, and look for the Bengals to potentially upset the Chargers, and potentially for it to not necessarily be anywhere close. I think this could be a huge blowout in this game if, the Chargers defense doesn't perform to its lofty standards. So that's why I feel like, sometimes when I'm doing these shadow reports, I look at a lot of highly favorable matchups that can play into your advantage. And if you're a Jamar Chase owner, you already are monitoring his every move. You already know his excellence at the position. You already know he already has a 55.4 point performance to his name. So this one is just an easy matchup where you can say this is going to be a blowout. Jamar Chase wins this easily. And so that's why you have to always be proactive when it comes to things of that nature. And then for our final matchup of the week here, Zay Flowers versus Joey Porter Jr. This is an underrated one because I've kind of been disappointed in what I've seen out of Zay Flowers all season. He's always shown glimpses of what he can be and what he could do for the Ravens, but players like Bateman likely have improved ahead of him, and he's slowly falling down that Ravens pecking order in terms of target share, in terms of snap share as well. So this could be a career-defining game against the Steelers defense that you're going to have to expose through the air, through that secondary. And Joey Porter Jr., not for nothing, while I do think he has a lot of upside, a lot of raw potential, is a potential weak link here for the Steelers. He's not someone who I feel like can consistently hold up down after down against a Ravens team that can hurt you through the air when need be. Especially, if they're utilizing Derrick Henry, and that front seven is gassed, and the Ravens are throwing the ball willy-nilly because they know they're not facing any pressure from that front seven. So look for this matchup to potentially be a matchup where Zay Flowers can kind of integrate himself back into the favors of this offense. Now, I don't necessarily think a lot of fantasy football managers are this high, this late into the season on Zay Flowers either, but it's interesting to see if he can have a consistent, solid performance as a blueprint of what we want to see out of him in the future. Because let's say he does have a solid performance this week. A lot of fantasy football managers are not going to have him on their roster, so they're probably going to disregard it. But if you want to be a little bit more proactive and follow him and continue to see how he improves, then chances are next year when you're either in a dynasty league or a deeper league, you might want to pick him up and see if he can expand on certain performances. Because I think he has a future here for Baltimore. I think he can be a key component of their success over the next 5 to 10 years. But it just has to translate onto the field. Now, in summation of this segment, all four of these guys, right? Jaden Reed, Courtland Sutton, Jamar Chase, and Zay Flowers. Not a lot in common here. I feel like we all know that Jamar Chase is perhaps the best fantasy wide receiver right now. But out of all these guys, I don't necessarily see one outside of Jamar Chase that a lot of fantasy football managers will be hopeful about or are constantly monitoring to see whether they should start them or sit them. I feel like there's a lot of hope and optimism with all three of these guys. How it translates onto the field is yet to be seen. And so these all feel like proven matchups outside of the Jamar Chase one, where each of these guys kind of has a chip on their shoulder and they really need to prove themselves in these matchups, in these hardcore, nitty-gritty matchups especially, to kind of constitute me continuing to see them as players who in the future could reach the stratosphere from a fantasy perspective. Let me know what you think in the comments, because that will just about do it for today's show. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show in the network if you so choose. Consider making yourselves available to this super chat, super thanks, and super stickers features here on YouTube to contribute and interact with the show while we are live streaming. Great way to get your thoughts on air. But other than that, thank you. Happy Wednesday to you all, and I am out.